Tim, I met for the first time 7 or 8 years ago at Velocity Conference, and I just have to say he may not be the tallest man in perf anymore, but he's definitely the kindest man in perf, unless he's talking about Andy Davies, in which case he's not so kind. But Tim is going to kick everything off for us today. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.
Thanks, Katie. In my defense, Andy totally started that. No, and I can relate to I just anecdotally on the YouTube comment that struck me as funny. Has nothing to do with this talk. But we went into school with my kids in 5th grade, and they have like a board where all the kids are able to put like what they want to be when they grow up. I'm not even lying, like 60% of the kids put YouTuber as their career aspirations. So that's, it is a thing. All right, you know what I've never been like, don't you just hate it when it's like, it's in the morning, you just got in, you're kind of tired, and then the speaker has the gall to be like, hey, we're all going to do something together now? Like, isn't that the worst? I've never done that. We're going to do it today, all right? So I know it's early. I know it's day 2. I know there was a really nice party, thank you, Speed Curve, last night. I'm also very aware that it is Amsterdam, and it is quite possible that some of you didn't even go to bed last night and just came straight here. But we're going to do it. I want to, something kind of simple, something just to get us all in sync, energized, fired up, and ready to go. Are we ready for this? Yeah, that's about how I thought it would sound. Okay. All right, on the count of 3, here's what we're going to do. Everybody's going to blink. Are we ready? Can we handle that? Okay. 1, 2, 3, blink. Everybody do it? A couple of you might have held out. All right, so everybody feeling good now? The energy's up and running? Like, that's good, right? Yeah, that's today's workout for us. Now, for most of you in the room, that probably took about 100 to 150 milliseconds. There is some data that suggests that maybe it can go as long as 400 milliseconds. I suspect that's for the people who were out until 4 a.m. in the morning. I think as long as you're bright, it's probably in that 100 to 150 millisecond range. That's not a very big number, but I think it's actually a very interesting one because there's a lot of connections to performance when we talk about that 100 millisecond threshold. For one, I've always been kind of fascinated by the number of studies that show the impact 100 milliseconds can have on a business. Walmart finding 100 milliseconds equaled a 1% increase in revenue. Zalando, who was mentioned yesterday, 100 milliseconds meant a 0.7% increase. Amazon actually found the same thing, but like in reverse, if you 100 milliseconds slower meant they lost 100%, so very similar to Walmart. And we also had Mobify back in the day talking about 100 milliseconds on a checkout page load time meant a 1.1% improvement in session conversion, leading to about $500,000 across all their properties annually. So it is a small number, but it is a meaningful number. Now, the other place we hear this brought up is when we talk about perception thresholds. And I know Alex had shown a little bit of that from Microsoft's guidelines yesterday. That 100 millisecond threshold is what we view as instantaneous, and this comes from a paper back in 1968 exploring the human response to digital interfaces. And so the author made the statement that no more than 0.1 seconds to have this instantaneous thing. Now, there's all sorts of reasons why there's some question marks as to the actual, is this really 100 milliseconds? How precise is that? But I'm going to gloss over those. What I thought was interesting, though, is you really don't have to read much further to see your first sign that, maybe this isn't in hard science. It's actually about a paragraph later. There we go, it's about a paragraph later. In 1968, he was already observing that, look, just so you know, this actually might be a little slow. This might be too slow for people who have more experience. So the idea here being that the more experience we have with it, the more we interact with it, the more comfortable we come with that system, the more we expect out of that. Did you know it only takes us about 13 milliseconds to process a visual image? That's it. If we flash an image in front of you on a screen, it takes you about 13 milliseconds, and you can recall most of what's going on. There's a certain limit, of course, to the fidelity of that, but that's all it takes. And that's a number that has gone down with recent studies over the years. It started off higher, it's been going down and down, partly maybe because of our precision in how we're able to measure it, but the other theory here is that we're just getting better at it. As we spend more time with digital interfaces and visual imagery, we just get better at processing that stuff. See, expectations aren't constant. They change. And as technology improves, our expectations of what that technology is, what that technology is capable of, and how that technology should behave changes as well. We hear that argument all the time about, devices getting faster, networks getting faster, and I feel like several people yesterday, Anna, Alex, did a really good job of sort of dispelling that, right? Like it's not evenly being distributed. But even let's just pretend that it is. Let's accept this premise for a second that technology is getting faster and faster, and this is what the reality of the situation is. There's two problems that occur when capabilities improve at a rapid pace like this. The first is Jevons paradox. The idea being that the more we have of a resource, the more we consume of the resource. Now, this was something that was first brought up in the context of coal consumption, but it's something we've seen play out with the number of cars on a road. It's things we've seen play out with technology. As we get more powerful devices, as we get more powerful networks, what do? We throw more things at them. The problem with this is that someone is always left holding the bag. Like, not everybody gets to benefit from this situation, right? There was a thread earlier this year, I believe on LinkedIn, where somebody was talking about how it was a waste of time to focus on performance, particularly on those low-end things. Like they were talking specifically about why they would ever test on like a low-end Android device. Why would they test on a 3G network? Because their users on 3G don't buy anything. And I just want to just break that apart for 1 second. They do not focus on improving the terrible performance on 3G networks of their site. Users do not buy anything on the 3G experience on their site. I wonder why that is. Someone is always left holding the bag. We don't all get to benefit from this situation. And it creates a little bit of a problem, right? Because if we're testing on those devices and we're having those fast experiences, that's why we start to accept that certain solutions become acceptable and appropriate for the web. You go back, the beginning of responsive design around that time, I was working on a project for a large US company. We had like 50 phones we were testing on. It was great times. And it was all based on their analytics. And a couple of their very popular BlackBerry devices were massively popular for going to their site. And what we found in testing was that, like, hey, even including jQuery on the site was enough to crash the browser on BlackBerry. That was it. Like, it didn't have to do a thing. Just the presence of it alone was enough to crash the entire thing. We had these built-in inherent constraints, and we were like, all right, well, we're going to have to be more creative. We're going to have to lean into the browser a lot more to make things happen. The only reason we ever kind of came to the conclusion that maybe we could get away with shoving a bunch of stuff and relying more and more on JavaScript is because some devices it was acceptable for. So we always have this paradox. We're going to throw more and more at technology as it gets better. The second bit that comes into play here is the hedonistic treadmill. This is usually applied in the concept of wealth, but the idea here is that as resources become more powerful, as they become more available, our expectations increase and they diminish our initial satisfaction. Again, wealth is the usual comparison, but I'm going to use like wine, right? All right, so you start off, you have your first red wine that you've ever had, and you're like, oh, this is not bad. I could get into red wine. Then you have another one, and it's a little bit better, and you're like, oh, I like that red wine. That was really good. The other stuff was kind of cheap. Then someone treats you to a really nice bottle one time, and you're like, oh, that is red wine. I don't know what the heck the other stuff is, but I'm not going back to it. And then the more you have of this, the more it stops being like this outer body experience. It just becomes like, oh, that's wine. That's what it is. Our expectations shift, and our satisfaction shifts as a result. I thought an interesting application of this in the last week at home was I was sitting down with my 7-year-old. My boys and I we're big basketball fans. We like the San Antonio Spurs. That's how you know they're good kids. None of that Laker nonsense or anything like that. And their favorite player is Victor Wembanyama, 20-year-old guy out of France, 7'4", ridiculous talent. And so my son had been saving up some money, and he wanted to buy a Victor Wembanyama rookie card. So what we did is we went off to eBay and searched for Wembanyama, sorted by cheapest so that he could kind of find which ones he wanted to do. And then I just slid the laptop over in front of him and let him go. And so we started doing this. He started scrolling down. He would find a card that looked kind of interesting that he could afford. He'd click on it, take a peek, and then go back. You know, it's the choice paralysis thing. He couldn't make up his mind. And everything about this was very normal, nothing absolutely out of the ordinary at all, until we got to the pagination part. And we get to page 2, and he taps, and then he taps, and then he taps. Now, we've heard of rage clicks. This wasn't a rage click. This was the most calm rage click I've ever witnessed. But all of these taps happened within a couple hundred milliseconds. It was a small time period. And I was just like, hold on, buddy, just give it a second. You know, I sounded like basically what my father-in-law sounds like when I try to work on his computer in the middle of nowhere. But I was like, yeah, just give it a second. Like, I'm a performance nut. I've been doing this for a long time. If anybody should get grumpy about, like, a pagination taking a while, it's me. But I thought it was fine. In fact, I'm pretty sure it would have passed every single threshold we have for a good experience. It was not a slow experience. But to my son, it was like, oh, there's nothing happening, like I'm doing something wrong or something's broken here, what's going on? So I thought about this, and I was like, why wasn't he freaking out about the listings? Like, this wasn't a problem until we got down there. And then it occurred to me that whenever he would click on a listing, what happens is we open in a new tab. And so when they do this, that's kind of flashing a little fast there, isn't it? We're going to pause on that. Whenever he does this, the response is instantaneous. The browser's doing a lot of heavy lifting. It's opening that new tab right away. And there's still time that has to happen for the page itself to come into display. But his feedback, the affordance that something occurred, going again back to some of the stuff Anna talked about, was immediate. Like, he immediately saw the impact of his what he was doing with that technology, with that interaction. And it occurred to me that, like, I have grown up with a very different set of expectations for what it means to use the web. I'm not quite as old as Grigsby, but like that same thing that he mentioned with the mosaic and the website sucking in his first experience of the internet being like, hey, this sucks and it's slow, that's not far off from where I was either. Like, dial-up modems and stuff, they were terrible. Like, you'd set it up, you'd start the connection, and then you'd go walk away and come back a few minutes later. You know, every page load was the same thing. My first phone was a Nokia that could barely get online. I live in the middle of nowhere, a small town of 1,200 people. I grew up in a town that was half that size. When everybody else was talking about 4G and how fast that was, we were sitting on 2G if we were lucky. It's usually some sort of an edge thing that happened to not quite be 2G caliber. We only recently, like probably within the last 12 to 15 months, got 5G for most of the area where I live in. And there's still parts where we go around and it's like it's just a dead zone. You're going to get maybe like some 3G equivalent if you're lucky. Like, I have learned patience. I have learned that, like, okay, look, it's not going to be very quick, it's not going to be very instantaneous, and it's just something I'm going to have to deal with. But my son hasn't learned that. My son's experience with technology has been primarily games. Very quick, very responsive feedback, instantaneous. When he is on the web, he's using a MacBook Pro. We've got a good connection at home. To him, the web should be like this. That's his expectation. Expectations are not constant. Expectations are learned through experience. And so as technology improves, our expectation of what we expect that technology to do and what we expect it to be capable of shifts as well. And so we're at this sort of interesting spot where I feel like we've got these two buckets. And now the situational performance is absolutely a thing. We don't all live in one of these buckets all the time, but these buckets I think are still helpful for thinking about the situation. On the one hand, we have sessions that are coming from those less than ideal situations, scenarios where maybe the device is taxed, maybe it's a lower end device or a cheaper device, maybe the network has intermittent connectivity, maybe we're roaming and we've got some sort of data throttling still going on, which is still a thing. We've got these less than ideal scenarios and the web's not quite fast enough for them. On the other hand, we've got this new wave, this new generation, people coming up with technology where they're experiencing it on high-end devices and high-end networks, and they're coming in with these really high expectations for what we should be able to do on the web. And I worry a little bit. I do think we're settling a little bit into the middle here. Like, at the moment, I think the web operates in this sort of middle space where we're not quite fast enough for those in the less than ideal situations, and we're not quite fast enough to keep up with the rising expectations that we have from folks either. So I think we have an opportunity, though, to change this. And there's actually a couple of reasons why I'm very, very optimistic that this is going to happen. First off, and it was brought up several times yesterday, but Core Web Vitals has been a massive success in getting an increased focus on performance It wasn't that long ago where most of the performance conversations happened in side rooms on our own isolated events. And now you can't go to, if you have conferences that you're still going to, I know that's been a little slow coming back, there's always at least one performance talk. We asked people who was the first time here yesterday, and there's so many hands that shot up. We have all sorts of folks that are new to the community and new to performance. We have an absolute explosion of tools and monitoring that are being built around this and built around the other initiatives that we've seen from Lighthouse and things like that. We have more options than ever in this community. Core Web Vitals has been a huge, huge part of that. It's been opening up with the SEO carrot, opening up wallets, opening up budgets, and improving the interest. And I do worry a little bit sometimes that maybe there's a risk of treating them like a checklist. I have seen situations where we're like, all right, we're going to tick the box on these 3 metrics, and then we're good, and we're going to call it a day. I would just like to challenge, especially those of us in the room, to kind of consider Core Web Vitals. I feel like they are a better starting point than they are a finish line. Tammy brought up some really good stuff in her presentation yesterday where she was talking about, maybe your thresholds are going to be different. Maybe the impact for those metrics are different. Maybe we need to be looking at probably other metrics as well, especially, e-com sites. A large percentage of your mobile traffic is probably Safari. It's dominantly Safari for most e-com shops that I've worked with. So there is a need to go beyond it. So we got to be careful not to settle it, but as a whole, that initiative has been really, really successful in drawing interest. And so when we get this explosion of new people, we get this explosion of monitoring tools, we get this explosion of testing tools, we get this explosion of ideas, and I think that's incredibly healthy and powerful advantage that we have, because while we like to romanticize it sometimes, innovation very, very rarely comes from individuals. It comes from a collision of ideas. It comes from everybody bouncing things off of each other, seeing what each other are doing, and try to iterate and improve on top of that. And so I think we're poised for an explosion of innovation as we move forward in the next few years because we have this rapidly growing ecosystem. The second reason I'm really optimistic is I feel like in the last few years we're starting to see a return to the browser. We're seeing a bunch of new technologies and improvements happening that are making it easier and easier to do really impressive stuff without having to resort to extra layers of complexity. Last year when I was up, I mentioned fetch priority, which I believe, Robin threatened us with a sword if we didn't actually implement this thing. But I remember saying in my talk that fetch priority was it was incredible. The fact that we can get a several hundred millisecond boost from a single HTML attribute, that just doesn't happen. I was wrong. I was absolutely wrong. We've had a flurry of exciting improvements to the web that are all an attribute or a couple bytes of code, and that's it. We've got fetch priority for being able to put some emphasis on those images and stuff that we're loading. Yesterday, there was a lot of talk about the lazy loading attribute, being able to lazy load images without having to have 100 kilobytes of JavaScript. We've been doing that for years that way, and now it's just a single attribute. Speculation rules, which is out there, is super exciting. This is, okay, it's not a single attribute, but this little blob of JSON, what is this, a couple bytes, maybe a kilobyte? This little bit here is enough to say that anytime you go over and you hover any of the links on a page that are internal links, and it looks like they're about to interact with it, go ahead and pre-render that page in another tab, get a head start. This is, again, something where we've seen so many JavaScript-based solutions over the time, and we don't need it anymore. It's literally just a little blob of JSON and shove it in the page, and you're good to go. View transitions. How exciting are view transitions? The idea that we have the ability now to do seamless page-to-page navigation and transitions. It doesn't have to be this quick cut that we always were trying to do. Well, we hoped it was a quick cut, sometimes a slow cut. But to have these beautiful transitions between pages. You can get more complex with it. You can tap into it with JavaScript if you want. There are things you can do with keyframes and CSS, but even just this little line puts a nice little transition, a nice soft transition as you're navigating between pages. And anecdotally, on projects that I've seen this rolled out on, the feedback from users just from this has been really good. It's just a little bit of a nice embellishment and touch. All of this stuff is available now with just a few lines of HTML or a few lines of CSS. That is pretty freaking incredible. Betting on the browser is our best chance for long-term success. It's always been our best shot at long-term success. We need some of these other solutions because that's where the innovation comes from. We need people who are willing to try to push the limits and go outside of that. But at the end of the day, you can't beat the browser. Like, we're not going to solve performance issues by dropping in more code, like by adding more layers of complexity. We solve performance issues by relying on the platform and the browser to help us get there. Good performance doesn't have a shortcut. There's no shortcut to doing this. There's no, like, drop this in and it fixes everything. The way we get to a seamless, fast experience on the web that everybody can benefit, that improves the experience for the folks that are in those less than ideal situations, that lets us provide an experience where it's still, they can use the web, they can access the web, they can get the things they need to get done, while at the same time meeting the rising expectations that we have with this new generation coming in, where it's like, hey, we haven't learned yet that the web needs to be slow, so why the heck does it need to be slow? The best way to fit both of those, to help reach both of those audiences, that comes from hard work and a ruthless obsession for the user experience. I think we're better equipped than ever to make this happen. So let's get to work. Thanks.